I think most people who are interested in history eventually come to a point within their research that gets extremely frustrating. And the frustration that we eventually run into as researchers is the mainstream historical chronology and all the really crazy stuff that mainstream people believe, despite there being no historical or scientific evidence to back it up. When we start looking at ancient history, one of the first things we all do is we go to mainstream sources, because that's what we're exposed to first, generally anyway. And that's what we learn. And it's fine if you don't get too deep into what the mainstream believes. If you just kind of stay on the surface, mainstream history sounds like it's correct. But for all of us who dig just a little deeper, we immediately begin to run into problems. And the first problem that we run into is mainstream history itself. Generally, what happens to most of us is that we are indoctrinated with, mainstream ideologies. What the mainstream historical authorities say goes, right? Anybody in a university, they have the power, they set the trend, and if you go against that trend, right, you're crazy. You're a conspiracy theorist. You smoke crack all day. Like, that's literally what they think about those kinds of people. So the vast majority of us are trained to not question that particular authoritative point of view. However, stuff gets frustrating because, as you stick to the mainstream historical chronology, it does not take very long for you to have all kinds of problems with it and legitimate questions. Now, this is the first area where a lot of people will essentially kill their research because they do not want to go any further than this point because they've been trained to not go further, and they will stop and they will rebound back into mainstream chronology, and then they will get lost, in that world entirely. However, if you keep going, you start looking around and you realize, all right, well, hey, maybe these guys don't have it right, but let me go look around. Let me go see what I can find. One of the things that we do then is that we eventually go and start just reading the histories as our ancestors recorded them. This is actually an extraordinarily interesting conundrum because I've noticed that when people study history, they're not going to the source generally first. Nobody goes directly to, say, a Mayan source and starts to try to read and transcribe all the stuff that those guys wrote in, say, the Dresden Codex or something, right? That takes time, that takes effort, and it's difficult. So we don't do that. We just listen to a mainstream source who has, supposedly done that correctly, and then we say, okay, fine, good, whatever, I don't have to do that, and we move on. However, if we stop and we actually go and we look at the original works, if we look at the actual histories that are being told and recorded by our real ancestors, not an authoritative institution, but our actual, the people whose, their entire job was to carry it on down the line, one of their jobs. It's not your entire job. I guess there was probably I don't know, maybe I guess some, anyway, you get what I'm saying, right? I mean, my point is that mainstream does not direct you immediately to the source. They direct you to whatever they have decided is the correct conclusion. All right, so that's what we run into. When we start to push that stuff aside and we're like, all right, fine, but we need to listen to these histories. When we start looking at the original histories, a lot of insane stuff starts to pop up. And a lot of the insane stuff that you start to immediately run into, you will find has been absolutely brushed away by mainstream chronologists because they say, oh, anything that's too crazy in these stories, it's just fiction, right? They're not recording any actual history. They're just, writing down fairy tales or whatever. They're trying to scare their children or they're I don't know, or they're on drugs. It doesn't matter. The point is that the history that they supposedly recorded is not real. I mean, and that's the position of mainstream historians. For example, there are histories around the world which claims that there was some sort of a huge dragon in the sky at some point, and it was raining down, death and destruction. And this theme is actually found all over the planet. It's very interesting. However, something like this to a mainstream historian is instantly pushed to the side, right? Because, I mean, if somebody is going to make a claim that a dragon is flying around and it's, destroying everything, okay, you got it. It's kind of tough to believe that, right? And it's funny, on the dragon side of things, like, that's an actual fact. There are absolutely histories all over this planet that record an event like this, right? The Chinese dragon, that famous kind of swirly or bumpy, you know what I'm talking about. It's like a string smushed together, that kind of dragon. It's got like the Chinese mustache thing. Anyway, that kind of a dragon exists not just in China, but that story and that concept exists all over the world. However, I mean, it's like it's a dragon. How am I supposed to buy into that, right? And so, rightfully so, sort of, mainstream people will push that to the side because it's crazy. And then, to make matters worse, we will have, alternative researchers start making the claim that, oh yes, dragons were real flesh and blood and they actually existed because all of our ancestors recorded it, right? So they go to the other side of the spectrum completely, saying that yes, these pictures depict a legitimate dragon stomping around the planet, slapping people, and then, tickling their butts and everything. I mean, this is the way that it goes. There's nothing in between, generally speaking. For your average person who runs into this particular kind of a story, those are the two sides you get, right? And there's no real other, there's no other option generally handed to you. And the reason why is because nobody else, generally speaking, at least, easily discoverable, is going to have an answer for you, right? Because both sides have been polarized, and now that's all we get. So when we find ourselves in a situation like this to where neither side really has a satisfactory answer for what was going on with respect to ancient history, what do? You're just kind of left in the middle wandering around. Now, that is not a bad position to be in. In fact, that's like the best position you could ever be in. Because if you find yourself in the middle, you are not committed to any kind of an ideology. You can just say, I don't know, and move on with life. And then hope eventually you will run into the information that might actually answer the question for you. So basically what we find ourselves looking at when we look at ancient history is we find a huge string of events that are just absolutely insane. The dragon thing is just one example of probably thousands of insane things that go, tens of thousands, just tons of crazy stuff, right? And I get it, this is why the mainstream gets away from it, and then this is also why the alternative mainstream will latch onto it a little too hardcore, and then we create a situation to where everything goes to hell in a handbasket, and then it's just annoying, and you just want to start choking people, because it's like, oh my, you just stay in the middle, just say, I don't know, that's all you have to do. It's that simple, you just, that's it. All right, so we are going to chill in the middle. But what I want to do today, while we chill in the middle, is I want to look at a weird topic that nobody really talks about because it is so weird. But it's a topic that is discussed by our ancestors all over the planet. And that topic would be one of mana. What the hell is mana? Like this, we have cultures all over this planet that end up recording a source of nutrients that falls from the sky, and they call it mana. And this is found in cultures all over the planet. Doesn't matter. Mediterranean, Middle East, European, South America, North America. I mean, it's everywhere. Polynesia. This concept is all over the place. Now, two things we need to get straight before we go further and start to look into this is one, this has nothing to do with video game mana. Get that out of your mind right now. Stop that. We're not discussing that garbage, right? Thing number two is that it is important to remember that when we discuss mana on this particular show, we are referencing essentially what would be known as the food of the gods, right? It would be a physical material that our ancestors literally consumed to stay alive. All right, so it's not some sort of a mystical life force thing that is ethereal. No, what we are discussing is any culture that talks about this, mysterious kind of fluid stuff that comes down from the sky, and that's what subsisted a lot of cultures all over this planet, apparently, for a small period of time. And it also wasn't just humans that subsisted off of this manna, it was also essentially all life on the planet that was apparently more or less able to use this substance to continue on. Now, for those of you who are like, all right, fine, but isn't this kind of like a Bible thing? And, the Bible is kind of crazy. Yeah, manna is in the Bible. But like I said, manna is in everything, right? So this is not just a biblical situation or an Israelite situation, more to the point, right? Because there's one of the parts of the stories of Exodus, and this is important to all of history, but at some point in time in the desert, manna rains down, and the Israelites are supposedly supposed to have subsisted on it. And that general story is actually found all over the world. Right, so I mean, it's not just, okay, well, like I said, it's not just Bible stuff, right? We have ancient Egyptians. They also reference the concept of manna, but they called it a dew bread or manna of heaven in the ancient Egyptian texts. So basically, everyone's going to have their own name. So I'm using manna, but everybody's got their own sort of translated version of it. Milk and honey, anytime you hear any culture referencing milk and honey, that would also apparently be manna. So I mean, other cultures, right? Sumerians do it, the Greeks do it, the Persians did it. We have tons of North American Indian cultures that have it, and of course, as Aztecs and the Toltecs, or basically the main point is that this is an extremely easy subject to discover in all kinds of cultures' ancient histories. So when we run into something like this, when we perform comparative mythology, this is something that has to be paid attention to. If we find ourselves in a position to where all these cultures are talking about this mysterious substance that, not only just sounds interesting in a story, but is also intrinsically part of their history in the sense of their survival, things have to be taken perhaps a little more seriously. Because if we have cultures all over the planet saying, yes, after a certain event took place, the world seemed like it was dying. And then all of a sudden, from the sky, essentially rained the dew from heaven. A miracle substance delivered to humanity by the gods. Right? So this is what we find. Now, the first problem, of course, that we run into is the fact that these stories, they sound insane, right? Well, like at the beginning of the show, I said the main reason why a lot of stuff that our ancestors record are not taken seriously is for the simple reason that it's crazy. I mean, okay, everybody's saying that some sort of milk and honey stuff falls from the sky and everybody was able to subsist on this? Like, what are you talking about? And they don't just say that some of it falls from the sky or a little bit, I mean, they literally make the statement that every morning this stuff would just come raining down and you could store it and you could use it for all kinds of stuff. Literally miracle fluid, right? And so that's probably one of the other things that is also hard to believe, is that after a very particular cataclysm, suddenly all this mystery fluid rains down and humans are able to survive and subsist off of it. I guess that's the same word. Okay. But, okay, sounds crazy, and I get that, right? And so, I was in the same boat as everybody else back in the day when I would hear something like this, and it's like, all right, schizo, I get it. Your ancestors were all high on drugs. That's cool, bro. That's fine, and I moved on. And that's what most people do, because the concept is ridiculous. Or is it? Here's the thing. If we find ourselves in the position to where cultures all over this planet claim that this substance rained down from the sky, maybe there is something to it. Now, I get it. Right now, everybody's also probably wondering, but what the hell? What do you mean? How does this stuff rain from the sky, dude? I mean, this isn't... Okay, listen to me, all right? Just stop interrupting myself, and then we'll get to it, all right? So that's what we're going to do. You got that? Okay. So, before we get into the manna part, we have to set the stage, because there is an event that precedes the manna raining down from the sky. What we find when we look at these cultures relative to manna, we find that there is a huge cataclysmic event that takes place prior to manna raining down from the sky. And this event is essentially known as the Venus event. Now, just going to give a really quick basic background on this, and then we're going to move on to the mana portion. But this part is extremely important to understand because the science behind the cataclysm that is described prior to the falling of mana may be the catalyst, the chemical catalyst, that creates the situation where we find this stuff raining down from the sky. Now, the event is called the Venus event, generally speaking. Now, the Venus event is apparently a time that, if you believe in mainstream chronology, would have taken place around 1600-ish BC or so. For those of you who are operating under the new chronology, this event would have probably taken place potentially, early in the first millennium BC. And like I said, I don't have an exact date for you really at all. It would just be closer to us than the mainstream chronology would put it. Now, for those of you who are not necessarily too familiar with the Venus event concept, I know that just sounded schizo and insane, right? What are you talking about? What do you mean the Venus event? So what happened is that the planet Venus, only a few thousand years ago, and this is according to our ancestors, crossed Earth's orbit multiple times during this period that I kind of gave you guys, right? The 1600-ish, 1500-ish BC time period for mainstream chronology, and then, earlier than that for the new chronology. What do you mean though, bro? What are you talking about? Venus crossing over Earth's orbit? Yes, remember, we are basing this conclusion off of our ancestors' recordings, astronomical recordings back in the day. This is what they were charting. There is a very particular point, for some weird reason in human history, to where tracking the orbit of Venus becomes extremely important. And the reason why it became important, if we once again listen to the histories, is that everybody makes the exact same claim, that the planet Venus was in a cometary form and almost ran into Earth multiple times. This is where you get stories like the Jubilee, or the more famous, Mayan 52 years situation, right? Everybody around this time period suddenly is tracking Venus, and they're watching it almost hit Earth between every 48 and 52-ish years or so. Now remember, I did not just wake up and drink bleach and start making this up. I am just following what all of our ancestors talk about. Now, I get it, Venus going off course and intersecting Earth's orbit multiple times, sounds schizo, and I get that, but let me ask you this question. Why does that sound crazy to you? Technically speaking, there is nothing unscientific about the claim that one planet could cross the orbit of another planet. In fact, it happens right here in our own solar system, right? Pluto intersects Neptune's orbit. Right? That happens right now. And I know, Pluto's not a planet, blah, blah, blah. But you get my point, right? There's nothing weird about planetary bodies intersecting each other's orbits. All right, so scientifically speaking, everything I've said so far is completely possible, but that doesn't really answer the question of why it's so hard to believe. And the reality is, the only reason why this statement that our ancestors are making, I am not making the claim, it's them, but the only reason why this claim sounds insane to your average person is because your average person has been trained with the theory of uniformitarianism dominating every aspect of science and history. Now, I'm not going to get into the theory of uniformity in any depth because it absolutely pisses me off, and it's one of the most ridiculous theories that humans have ever created, and then even worse, of course, injected into the mainstream chronology. But essentially, what uniformitarianism says is that everything going on takes billions of years to happen. All natural functions, geology, cosmology, you name it, doesn't matter, right? Biology, everything takes billions and billions of years to slowly move forward. And that goes for everything, apparently. Right? The concept is ridiculous. Basically, uniformitarianism state that if we do not witness a particular natural process right now, then that particular process that we are imagining taking place could never have happened in the history of the universe. This is an extremely dumb perspective, all right? So we will toss aside the theory of uniformity for this particular show, or for life. Get rid of it. We don't need it. And what we're going to do is we are just going to listen to what our ancestors say about the manna situation. Now, really quick, back to the Venus event. So Venus almost impacts Earth multiple times. Now, Venus never actually contacts Earth. Just in case you were wondering, there is no planetary contact in the sense of two lithospheres smashing into each other. That never happens, all right? They never get close enough to achieve that. But that does not mean that the two planetary bodies would not interact at a distance. You have to remember, during this period of time, we are essentially working with two charged cosmological bodies coming into close contact with one another out in space. When this happens, what happens when two charged bodies get close to each other, right? They are going to find a way to essentially get to an equilibrium state of existence, right? There's going to be a charge exchange if these two planetary bodies get close enough to one another. And this is exactly what our ancestors record. It's very interesting when you read their stories about the Venus event, you find that this stuff is described very scientifically in some cultures. And then in other cultures, they're just described as they happen. However, once an outside person looks into that mythology, it sounds crazy because relative to the way that that particular culture records the event, it's not going to line up with anything that, basically your average person would understand. Especially nowadays, because nowadays none of us believe in anything really happening anymore due to the theory of uniformity. So when you hear some sort of a crazy event embedded into mythology, it's instantly discarded as insane. Right? But if we take it seriously, we find that cultures all over this planet, their histories line up with respect to the Venus event. Now, what's going on here is at this point in time in the solar system's history, essentially all of the planets are still trying to find the orbits that they have right now. And I know that also sounds crazy, and I don't want to get too crazy into it, but just understand that there was a point maybe 5, 10, 12, 15,000 years ago to where essentially our solar system was completely different. Something happened, and then all the planets were sent into scrambling around trying to find their new orbits within an electrically charged area. And that's key. Because one of the very interesting things that all of our ancestors describe are events that would take place or that you would expect to see in the sky if a charged planetary body came close to Earth. One of the effects that we would expect to see, and we do see this in history, is that as Venus approaches Earth, Venus itself has a cometary tail. The reason why it has a cometary tail is twofold. And the main thing really, is that it's interacting with the sun ultimately, right? So Venus essentially is just a comet in the sky, but on a planetary scale. As Venus is making its way closer and closer in towards the sun, it is shedding charge. And as it sheds charge, it sheds matter. Now, when Venus's electric field touches Earth's electric field at a very particular point, a lot of horrific things happen. And in fact, really bad stuff was happening even before that point, because you have to understand, it looks like at some point in time, Earth goes into Venus's cometary tail, and this is where you get all these crazy events taking place, like the shadow of death. This would be the explanation for those kinds of events, right? We find a pillar of smoke and a pillar of fire in all ancient cultures as well. That pillar appears to be Venus in cometary form. All right, so just imagine that, you see, you've got Venus, the head of the comet, it's just billowing out all kinds of plasma, dust, etc. And then eventually at some point in time, Earth actually hits that tail, and that's where things get dark and messed up and the atmosphere gets screwed up. But there's also a point to where Venus and Earth touch electrically. Their electric fields touch. When this happens, they start to talk to each other. And how do two charged bodies communicate? They zap each other. They start exchanging charge. And this is exactly what we find in the history books as well, right? We find thunderbirds in the North American area. We find huge lightning bolts coming down all over this planet, absolutely annihilating the land around it. And these lightning bolts literally take out entire civilizations, it looks like. Potentially one of these lightning bolts, not during this event actually, but one of these electrical events may have taken out Sodom and Gomorrah and buried it under the Dead Sea, for example. That's a different side. But this stuff is everywhere. And our ancestors record it as such, right? If we have two charged bodies interacting, we should see all kinds of calamitous events. And that is exactly what our ancestors described. All right, so I'm not going to go too much more crazy with that, otherwise the show will go for 12 hours. I'm just setting the stage, all right? So anyway, Earth has to deal with multiple passes-by of Venus throughout a few centuries. And then eventually, when Venus no longer threatens Earth, everything essentially starts to calm down and really does pave the way for humanity to get to the point where it is right now. Because one of the reasons, in my opinion, why humanity does not progress as fast as it really should have progressed is because these cataclysms it kept down everybody. These cataclysms wiped out cultures. They wiped out continents, right? They built up new land. They essentially scrambled humanity multiple times. So humanity was not able to develop like it really can when it is untouched, like nowadays. Right? Nowadays, we don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And look what's happening. We just keep progressing. If you want to call it progression, that's another topic, but you know what I mean, right? Anyway, so that's the situation we find ourselves in. So what happens is that Earth finds itself in a position to where the comet Venus makes another pass by, and it, makes a lot of destructive stuff happen on Earth, right? We have huge earthquakes, hurricanes. At one point in time during one of the passes by, is that a word, passes by? One of the near collisions, let's put it like that since I can't think of the correct terminology. What happens is that Venus, the charged Venus planetary body, actually attracts the oppositely charged oceans of the Earth and actually drags a mountain of water around Earth. So that actually explains why you find cultures with huge mountains of water in their history destroying entire continents. North American Indians literally watched this happen, and they survived part of it simply because they were actually able to outride it to a point, right? This wasn't like a giant tsunami rushing in. It was literally just a slow bulge of water being slowly dragged over Earth. Absolutely insane. That would have been one hell of a sight. Can you imagine that, dude? Like a 2-3 mile high mountain of water just rolling over your neighborhood. You're just watching it from a mountain. It's just absolutely crazy. Okay, anyway, so those are the kinds of events that took place. So needless to say, humanity is absolutely devastated multiple times over every 48 to 52 years. That's where you get that cycle, by the way. And also, for all you people who believe that Mayan calendar is still going, it is not. That calendar was designed to track Venus and to make sure that Venus would never show back up. The cycle is over. Yeah, sorry to burst that bubble, but there's no more cycle. It's gone. It's done. The solar system has moved on. We found equilibrium. There's no reason to worry about that stuff. We have plenty of other things to worry about. Don't worry. Okay. So anyway, that's the situation we find ourselves in. Now, Earth is destroyed, right? Multiple times over. You have all these descriptions in the histories of basically, in some cases, entire civilizations are gone. In others, it seems like it only left, a man and a woman, or a very small handful of people that were left to try to build things back up. Now, that does not mean that every single person on the planet died. There were lots of survivors. And it's interesting, too, because right now, when we try to look at human migrations, mainstream does not take any kind of a catastrophic event into account. So when they try to look at the human migrations of the planet, a lot of stuff really doesn't make sense. And you should see all the crazy fictional garbage that mainstream anthropologists inject into all of their human migration routes. It's hilarious. Once you add these particular catastrophes to the scene, then human migrations and human mixing makes a lot more sense, right? It's absolutely insane how scientifically viable so much of our history becomes once we just start to listen to what our ancestors are talking about and then apply scientific method and see if we can't prove that what they witnessed actually happened. Now, we're at a point to where we can do that with at least the catastrophes. Plasma physics helps us in that regard. All right, so fine. Now, how does this relate to the mana situation? See, I told you I'd get there. Yeah, I know. I need to make like a video about the Venus comet so I don't have to do this ever again. And I'm going to do that, fine. Okay, so what happens is after one of these pass-bys or one of these near collisions of Venus, Earth ends up getting into a particular part of the tail from Venus. And this is where Earth becomes shrouded in clouds. However, there's a point to where the clouds are not necessarily poisonous as they had been before. What happens is that suddenly all civilizations that survived this stuff record some sort of a food substance, some sort of an edible substance raining down from the sky. And this is where we will kick in with Velikovsky. Let's have him talk about this stuff because he's smarter than me and he can say this better than me and he won't waste as much time as I've wasted just to get to the main point of the goddamn video. Okay, let's go. So we're going to read a small section from Worlds in Collision by Immanuel Velikovsky. Velikovsky has done amazing stuff, and I get that not everything he did was perfect, but that's how we do science, right? And even he admitted things that he had to change scientifically. But never forget how many scientific hypotheses that Velikovsky came up with that eventually mainstream proved to be true. So Velikovsky is no joke. The stuff he talks about is something that needs to be paid attention to, even if initially it sounds insane. All right, so this section is called Ambrosia. And remember, everybody has their own names for mana, right? So you're going to hear different stuff. Okay, and also, don't forget, the comet Venus has just made a flyby, which means that Earth dealt with all of the darkness from the tail of Venus. Basically, at some point, the skies start to clear up. All right, so this section is called Ambrosia. In what way did this veil of gloom dissolve itself? When the air is overcharged with vapor, dew, rain, hail, or snows. Most probably, the atmosphere discharged its compounds, presumably of carbon and hydrogen, in a similar way. Has any testimony been preserved that during the many years of gloom, carbohydrates precipitated? Quote, when the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell upon it. It was like the hoarfrost on the ground. Unquote. It had the shape of coriander seed, the yellowish color of bdellium, and an oily taste like honeycomb. It was called corn of heaven, and it was ground between stones and baked in pans. The manna fell from the clouds. After the nightly cooling, the carbohydrates precipitated and fell with the morning dew. The grains dissolved in the heat and evaporated, but in a closed vessel, the substance could be preserved for a long time. Now remember, this is all sourced from various ancient sources as well, so he's not just making this up, right? Go get the book. It's like free online somewhere. You can go get it and look this stuff up, right? So that's what he's referencing. Basically, also what he's saying, just in case you guys didn't get it, is he's saying that there was potentially an electrochemical reaction in the atmosphere that bonded together hydrogen and carbon to essentially create a carbohydrate. And of course, you can eat carbohydrates and you could survive. Really quick, just as a frame of reference for the position he's starting with, he's starting from the position of the Exodus and that event. So basically, Moses doing his thing, and those guys ended up surviving, right, on milk and honey. So that's his starting perspective, but we'll get into other stuff. All right, the exegetes have endeavored to explain the phenomena of manna and were helped by the naturalists who discovered that a tamarisk in the desert of Sinai sheds its seeds during certain months of the year. But why should this seed be called corn of heaven, bread of heaven? Or why should it be said that it will rain bread from heaven? It is also not easy to explain how a multitude of men and animals could have existed for many years in a wilderness on the scarce and seasonal seeds of some desert plants. Were such a thing possible, the desert would be preferable to tillable land that yields bread to the laborer only in the sweat of his brow. Basically, what he's saying here is that the mainstream, they see the manna problem and they try to figure out a way to explain it. Right? And so, the exegetes, more Bible-istic type of people try to say, well, I mean, it didn't really rain from the sky. They just made that little seed that comes off this little plant. They made it sound godly, and that's what they did. That's their excuse. That's what Velikovsky is saying, is that's one of the coping mechanisms that mainstream historians use to try and explain away certain topics like manna. Right? And that's just from a biblical perspective. But yeah, they're trying to say that this little seed from this plant that does not produce that many of them, and it's seasonal, somehow provided life-giving nutrients to everything over there in the desert. Absolutely insane, absolutely stupid, but nobody really pays attention to this stuff because most people believe manna not a real thing. It's not a real problem that you need to deal with anyway. All right, let's keep going. The clouds brought the heavenly bread, it is also said in the Talmud. But if the manna fell from clouds that enveloped the entire world, it must have fallen not only in the desert of wanderings, but everywhere. And not only the Israelites, but other peoples too must have tasted it and spoken of it in their traditions. Yeah, see right here, this is how you do history. If we look back at a single ancient culture's histories and they describe some sort of an earth-destroying event or an earth-wide type of an event, we should then expect other cultures to report the same thing, shouldn't we? I mean, that's just basic logic. You can't have a worldwide event only affect one little culture on the planet. Everybody must have the story too. So we can actually use history as a potential predictive concept to see if it lines up with other histories around the world. And then when it does, we should pay attention to that, shouldn't we? Right? And that's what I love about this. You can almost run a real scientific test on history. If somebody makes a claim that something happened really bad in the past and the whole world felt it, then everybody else, by definition, should also have this story. If other cultures didn't have these stories, right, we could immediately dismiss this one culture story as being fiction. But what happens when everybody else has the story, right? And that's what we find ourselves in right now. All right, let's keep going. There was a world fire, says the Icelandic tradition, followed by the Fimbul winter, and only one human pair remained alive in the north. Quote, this human pair lie hidden in the holt during the fire of Surt, unquote. Then came the terrible Fimbul winter at the end of the world. Meanwhile, they fed on morning dew. And from them came the folk who peopled the renewed earth. Unquote. 3 elements are connected in the Icelandic tradition, which are the same 3 we met in the Israelite tradition. The world fire, the dark winter that endured many years, and the morning dew that served as food during these years of gloom when nothing budded. The Maoris of New Zealand tell of fiery winds and fierce clouds that lashed the waters into tidal waves that touched the sky and were accompanied by furious hailstorms. The ocean fled. The progeny of the storm and hail were, quote, mist and heavy dew and light dew, unquote. After the catastrophe, but little of the dry land was left standing above the sea. Then clear light increased in the world, and the beings who had been hidden between the sky and earth before they were parted now multiplied on the earth. That's actually a pretty interesting statement from the Maoris' history. The beings between the sky and the earth. There might be more to that. I don't know. I'm just saying. All right, let's keep going. This tradition of the Maoris has substantially the same elements as the Israelite tradition. The destruction of the world was accompanied by hurricanes, hail of meteorites, and sky-high billows. The land submerged, a mist covered the earth for a long time. Heavy dew fell to the ground together with light dew, as in the passage quoted from Numbers. The writings of Buddhism relate that when a world cycle comes to an end, with the world destroyed and the ocean dried up, there is no distinction of day and night, and heavenly ambrosia serves as food. See, I mean, already right here, all of these cultures have this stuff recorded. Now, remember, these guys are recovering from one of the worst catastrophes that ever hit Earth. This literally, by all accounts, like was just said here, the Venus event literally sunk continents. It literally rose continents out of the water, and it messed with the entire geology of the Earth's surface. And in fact, one of the interesting things about the Venus event is that this is probably where the vast majority of the mountains that we currently have right now came from. Now, that sounds crazy, I know at first, but don't forget, even mainstream geology does not still know exactly how mountains are formed. They have ideas, but they have not proven anything with their plate tectonic theory. Right? And that's a whole other thing we can destroy later. But it's funny, at the end of the day, there is no factual guaranteed way right now that a geologist can say how mountains were made. Also, what's even more interesting about the mountain building situation with respect to the Venus event is that all over this planet, even mainstream geologists admit that the vast majority of the mountains we see now achieved their current height. And I'm talking about the high mountains. I'm not talking about little foothills. I mean literally like the Alps, the Andes, etc. All of these mountains, even mainstream geologists admit, rose to their current heights during the history of mankind. How do you like that? Even mainstream geologists can't get away from the fact that all the mountain ranges that you see right now, they are all extremely recent. And by recent, I don't mean, 100 million years ago. Mainstream geology actually admits to only 10,000 years ago. Even funnier, if you believe in the Ice Age, which there's no reason to believe in, by the way. But even the people that believe in the Ice Age, even they have to admit that the mountain ranges did not exist during the Ice Age. That whole subject is hilariously bad, but that's the situation we are in. The evidence proves that some sort of insane cataclysmic event hit Earth not too long ago. Right, geologists will say 10,000 years, but the reality is it's probably only a few thousand years according to our ancestors. Okay, all right, I just wanted to set the stage. So anybody who believes that, these events did not take place, we have all the evidence to show that it did. So what we're talking about here, the event that destroyed humans everywhere. I mean, it destroyed humans everywhere, but it did it because it was so destructive, and the scientific evidence, oddly enough, supports this. And that's a whole other show. Okay, anyway, we set the stage for that. Where the hell was I? We talked about Buddhism. Yes, okay. In the hymns of the Rig Veda, it is said that honey, madhu, comes from the clouds. These clouds originated from the pillar of cloud. Remember what I told you the pillar was? That pillar of smoke? That was the comet tail from Venus. All right. Among the hymns of the Atharva Veda, there is one to the honey lash. Quote, "From heaven, from earth, the atmosphere, from the sea, from the fire, and from the wind, the honey lash hath verily sprung. This, clothed in amorite, ambrosia, all the creatures revering acclaim in their hearts." Unquote. Essentially what it's saying is that everybody got manna rained down on them, including plants and animals. The Egyptian Book of the Dead speaks of the divine clouds and the great dew that bring the earth into contact with the heavens. The Greeks called the heavenly bread ambrosia. It is described by the Greek poets in identical terms with manna. It had the taste of honey and a fragrance. This heavenly bread has given classical scholars many headaches. Greek authors from Homer to Hesiod down through the ages continually referred to ambrosia as the heavenly food, which in its fluid state is called nectar. But it was used also as an ointment. It had the fragrance of a lily, apparently, and as food for the horses of Hera when she visited Zeus in the sky. Now remember, the second we start talking about gods, gods are always related to planets. So if we're talking about Zeus, we're talking about Jupiter, which means we might be talking about something that people witnessed happening up in the sky that has been disguised relative to us today as some sort of a crazy mythology, with the gods and Zeus and Hera and all that. Anyway, Hera, which is Earth, was veiled in it when she hurried from her brother Ares, Mars, to Zeus, which is Jupiter. What could it be, this heavenly bread, which served also as a veil for a goddess planet, and was used as an ointment too? It was honey, said some of the scholars, but honey is a regular food for mortals, whereas ambrosia was given only to the generation of heroes. Then what was this substance that served as fodder on the ground for horses, as a veil for planets, bread from the sky for heroes, and that also turned fluid for their drink, and was oil and perfume for ointments? Right? It sounds crazy. This magical substance does all this crazy stuff. And by the way, remember, they're talking about Venus being veiled. Well, if Venus was in comet form, that's exactly what you would see. You would see a veiled planet, right? So there you go. It's all like right there. It's not even hidden. They literally tell us what happened, right? And I know, the Hesiod thing and on all the, the ancient Greek works, when we apply real chronology, suddenly those works are not being done in the BC era. They are being done during the Renaissance, which also makes things very, very interesting. Like, I get that. And we'll talk about that later. Let's just stick with the events as they are described before we start trying to figure out the real chronology, because, man, it's crazy. All right. It was the manna that was baked into bread, had an oily taste and also a honey taste, was found on the ground by man and beast, wrapped the earth and heavenly bodies in a veil, was called corn of heaven and bread of the mighty, had a fragrant odor, and served the women in the wilderness as ointment. Manna, like ambrosia, was compared with honey and with morning dew. The belief of Aristotle and other writers that honey falls from the atmosphere with the dew was based on the experience of those days when the world was veiled in the carbon clouds that precipitated honey frost. These clouds are also described as dreaded shades in the Kalevala. From these dreaded shades, says the Epos, honey dropped, and the clouds their fragrance sifted honey from their home within the heavens. The Maoris in the Pacific, the Jews on the border of Asia and Africa, the Hindus, the Finns, the Icelanders, all describe the honey food being dropped from the clouds. Dreary shades of the shadow of death that enveloped the earth after a cosmic catastrophe. All traditions agree also that the source of the heavenly bread falling from the clouds with the morning dew was a celestial body. I mean, it's crazy. Like, they literally tell us the planet Venus did a flyby and dumped all this garbage on us, right? They tell it outright. It's not even hidden. It's just unbelievable that nobody pays attention to this. Well, not nobody, but most people. Anyway, the Sibyl says that the sweet heavenly bread came from the starry heavens. The planet god Ukko, or Jupiter, is said to have been the source of the honey that dropped from the clouds. Athena covered other planet goddesses with a robe of ambrosial and provided nectar and ambrosia to the heroes. Other traditions, too, see the origin of the honeydew in a celestial body that enveloped the earth in clouds. For this reason, ambrosia or manna is called heavenly bread. Now, something of interest to note is that they just said right there that the planet god Ukko, which is Jupiter, is said to have been the source of the honey that dropped from the clouds. This is where things can kind of get a little messed up as well, because people may not be blaming the correct planet on what was spreading the honey. This is something we have to remember as well. In fact, Jupiter, oddly enough, gets some very interesting credit throughout all of these catastrophes here and there. He very often does not play a big role. He more plays a big role with other planets, with humans watching, from Earth, watching up into the sky as Jupiter slaps some planets around and stuff like that. But there is a point to where Jupiter is apparently our sun for a very short period of time while it tries to migrate over to our current sun. So Jupiter gets weird because okay, I don't want to get into all that. Anyway, it's interesting to note that when you find the stories of manna or ambrosia or the, nectar of the gods or whatever they call it with respect to whatever culture, pay attention to who's getting blamed for the heavenly bread. It's just something very interesting because it's one of the data points that I find it interesting because people are willing to blame not only Venus. Venus seems to be the planet that gets the most blame for the manna. But, for some weird reason, Jupiter gets it sometimes too, which begs the question, what part was Jupiter playing in this entire situation? The Venus event, by the way, is also accompanied by Mars in the background, and apparently Jupiter is back there as well. Not really close to Earth or anything, but still close enough to where our ancestors were able to see it. And by see it, I mean literally see like all the bands and belts that are on Jupiter, all the bands that swirl around. Our ancestors describe Jupiter looking like that. The only way they could have described that is if A, they had the technology to look at it, which right now we don't really have any necessary reason to believe existed, or B, that Jupiter was just closer to Earth than it is now. And once again, there's nothing unscientific about any of this, right? And all of our ancestors corroborate this stuff. Anyway, this particular situation to where Jupiter's kind of in the backdrop, Venus and Mars almost collide as well up in the sky while Venus is in cometary mode. This whole situation is fairly chaotic, and I'm still trying to figure out and find the true chronology of the events as it went along, because things just get weird. Like I said, but the Jupiter thing, it's like, what? Okay, anyway. Let's read this last little section, and then you can go back to your life and do something more important. While I go back to gang stalking my gang stalkers. Yeah, they never expect that. It's hilarious. You just kind of show up behind them and you're like, boo! And they're like, ah! And you start slapping them a little bit and you run away. Yeah, that's how you handle that, by the way. It's very simple. Okay, next section. It's very tiny, but it's important. Rivers of milk and honey. The honey frost fell in enormous quantities. The Haggadic literature says that the quantity which fell every day would have sufficed to nourish the people for 2,000 years. All the peoples of the East and the West could see it. A few hours after the break of day, the heat under the cloud cover liquefied the grains and volatilized them. The ground absorbed some of the liquefied mass as it absorbs dew. The grains also fell upon the water, and the rivers became milky in appearance. Yeah, right? Everybody describes, Jesus Christ. Okay. Anyway, everybody describes a very certain point in time when there are rivers of milk and honey, or the waters of the lakes and the oceans become, white with this substance. That's also a very common story that we find all over this planet. Right? Anyway, okay. Where the hell is that? Back. The Egyptians relate that the Nile flowed for a time blended with honey. The strange appearance of the rivers of Palestine in the desert, the Israelites saw no river, so they didn't record anything like that, by the way, so that makes sense, right? That's good stuff. Everything should be scientifically corroborable. Anyway, caused the scouts who returned from a survey of the land to call it the land that floweth with milk and honey. The heavens rain oil, the wadis run with honey, says a text found in Rosh Shamra in Syria. And by the way, it's funny, so the Venus event, it's interesting that they say oil. Oil actually appears to have also rained down onto Earth in certain areas. We find areas, for example, in South America to where we have stories of literal bitumen and oil raining down and drowning entire cities or villages or whatever they would have called them back then. But that's actually part of their story. So it's interesting to note that we find two kinds of hydrocarbons raining down from the sky. And this really adds to the authenticity of the stories, because if there was a chemical reaction that was taking place during all of these events that were going on, we could potentially find ourselves in a position to where a natural chemical reaction created the various hydrocarbons that rained down on Earth. You know, how do you like that? You can literally just use science to do this kind of stuff and potentially prove that all of this crazy stuff actually happened in the past. Right? Remember, these people are just describing what they found raining down on them and what they ate. There is nothing really fantastical about any of these stories. These stories are really just told in a historical sense. Right? Okay, anyway, let's keep going. In the rabbinical literature, it is said that melting of manna formed streams that furnished drink to many deer and other animals. The Atharva Veda hymns say that honeylash came down from fire and wind. Ambrosia fell, and the streams of honey flowed upon the earth. The broad earth shall milk for us precious honey, shall pour out milk for us in rich streams. The Finnish tradition narrates that the land and water were covered successively by black, red, and white milk. The first and second were the colors of the substances, ashes, and blood, that constituted the plagues of Exodus. The last one was the color of ambrosia, that turned into nectar on land and water. A memory of a time when the streams of milk and streams of sweet nectar flowed is also preserved in Ovid. So that's the end of that section. But isn't that amazing that we find cultures all over the planet describing the same kinds of events that we would expect to see if a cometary body the size of a planet was anywhere near Earth? We could expect to see a lot of these descriptions happen. And sure enough, it is in everybody's culture. He just talked about a couple of the other colors, right? The black and the red. It wasn't just the milk and honey that rained down, or I should say the manna from heaven. Like I said, we also find a situation to where literal oil rained down in certain areas. And then, of course, we also find a red mist that also lands on Earth. This would have been literally parts of Venus being blown off by the plasma stream and impacting Earth. Or not impacting, but raining down on Earth. Isn't that amazing? Like, all of the scientific things that we would expect to see, we see them in the history. I mean, it's like right there. There's no way around it. You just can't, there's nothing, you know, it's there, and it has to be acknowledged. We can't just continue to ignore all of that. All right, so you get it. Is it possible that manna was real, right? I mean, is this a real situation? And if it is real, what are the implications? I mean, this kind of gets crazy, because right now we have our ancestors all over the planet recording this. They tell us exactly what happened, and they all agree with one another. How is this possible if it's not real? I would argue that right now, this situation is worth taking seriously, because if you take this seriously on a scientific level, you will also find suddenly a lot of other scientific and historical questions that we don't really have answers to right now, you will find your answers. And it's nothing like you expect, which is, on one hand, it's crazy. But on the other hand, it's exactly what we should be expecting because we don't know everything, right? We can't say that we know every single process that exists. We can kind of guess at certain things or we can hypothesize about others. But, without actually seeing some of this stuff, it's hard for your average human to believe that something like that could happen. Even worse, you inject the theory of uniformity, and then that person is really not going to believe anything crazy like this. But once we start to listen to our ancestors, and in this case, take the Venus event seriously, we answer all kinds of questions. Suddenly you start to find out why in humanity, relatively recently, we have evidence of mass human extinctions, right? We have this in the genetic record, but geneticists don't, or not just geneticists, but nobody really has a great explanation as to why we see these mass human extinctions kind of out of nowhere, right? Mainstream science has nothing because mainstream science can really only rely on like a plague. Like that's kind of all they have. Or maybe there was a volcano somewhere that did something and, it just does not work scientifically. But at the same time, your average historian and scientist is not using the real tools that they have at their disposal. So they are never going to be able to come up with a realistic answer to their questions for the simple fact that they are not listening to the histories that our ancestors recorded, right? So we have to take it seriously. If manna is real, if this actually happened, it opens the door for all kinds of other questions. Oh, I got one more thing for you, actually. If you go, and I believe it was Brian Forrester's video. He does a lot of cool little videos of just walking around. I really appreciate those. Just, you just walk around the sites and you look at stuff. I appreciate he did that, but one of the things that he found, or they all, not he, but everybody sees when you go deeper underground, there are some areas where there is this mysterious black substance. I would conjecture that that substance might actually be decomposed manna. I believe that might be a possibility. Anyway, something to think about, all right? Okay. Go do something productive with your life. God knows I'm not going to.